ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners, please be advised that this conversation contains content that might be upsetting. Please use discretion when listening.
Debra Dank grew up in the far west of Queensland in Camooweal, where her dad sang her slim dusty songs while her mum gave her a love of books and the discipline of academic learning. But although this was where Debra grew up, it wasn't her home. Home was across the Northern Territory border and up towards the Gulf of Carpentaria. Debra is a Gudanji and Wakaja woman. She's an educator, a mother and a grandmother. And she's now written down the old stories of the Gudanji and the new ones she's made on country with her own family. Her book is We Come With This Place. Hi, Deb.
Hi, how are you, Sarah?
Tell me about your home. Where is Gudanji country?
Gudanji country is, of course, in the most amazing part of Australia.
Just speaking completely objectively there, Debra.
And totally unbiased. It's in the Gulf of the Northern Territory, and it has this beautiful range of open plains, huge, vast plains, and then the gorges and the big rivers. So, when we're at home, we think it's the middle of the universe. Others kind of identify it as remote, but of course it isn't for us. It's just home. So Wakaja Gudanji, and so from Camooweal all the way back up towards Borroloola, that's home. It's beautiful.
What are the sounds when you're out there on country?
Silence, lots of silence, and then all of this other conversation. As a First Nations person, we talk about the relationship and the kinship that we have with all of the non-human entities across our place. And so there's this layer of silence that you sit with, and then listening through the silences, you can hear the different birds and the scuffling in the grass and all sorts of sounds, and interspersed with all of that are the smells, and the smells are a whole other story around who you are in company with. So it's a pretty amazing thing.
Tell me about the different smells depending on the company that you're with.
Well, if you're sitting near a river and there's that smell of rotten fish, of course, the company that you are keeping is not necessarily the best kind, because it's, there's a crocodile lurking somewhere. So it's a good time to move. My family, my dad has been a ringer, was a ringer for quite a bit of his working life. So the smells of cattle are always really familiar, and it doesn't take much for that smell to come back into my nose. Horses have been my friends for a very long time. So the texture of the horses, the skin and all of that sort of stuff, and the smells have this whole other story business happening.
So when you spend a lot of time away from your country in terms of work and where you live, when you're back there, do you feel your body relax into it, or what happens to you on the inside once you're back home?
It's really funny because I'd never ever thought about it, but a couple of things have made me a lot more conscious of it. I was teaching at a university down here, and a colleague said to me one day, he said, "You've just come from home, haven't you?" And I said, "How did you know?" He said, "You walk a different way, you talk a different way, and your hair is really wild." And I thought, I don't have wild hair, but, if that's it. And then my son, my youngest child, and my 3 children are all grown now, and I have 2 granddaughters. But when my son was about 5 or 6, we'd get to Winton-ish, and he'd say, "Oh, we've got to change now, haven't we, Mum? We've got to change from speaking whitefella way to now we can talk like us. We can go back to talking like blackfellas again." And, if we were coming from the Territory back into Queensland, he'd say the opposite. So those two things have made me really aware of, okay, yep, it does cause change. It does.
What's the story of the Water Women founding that part of country?
It's one of the really big dreaming stories that starts up towards Nooka Way in the Northern Territory, and it's the Murrumbarna songline. So those water women, they travelled over toward somewhere maybe close to the Stewart Highway in the Northern Territory, down towards Tennant Creek Way, and then back up towards Borroloola. But when they get to my place on Gudanji country, they stopped and held ceremony. They held ceremonies all the way along that journey, but they held a ceremony at a place that we call now Gurringinny. And it's a really big dreaming story for women. It's a really important site for women, and very, very tragically and very scarily at the moment, that site is not so far from where a number of big miners want to frack. So it's really quite worrying at the moment, because Gudanji women's ability to maintain that contact is being threatened in a very real way, in a very real sense.
You spent much of your childhood around Camooweal. What was it like as a place to be as a little kid?
Camooweal was always really good. It was a good, solid community. There were probably maybe about 5,000 people living there when I was growing up. It was a really lovely community. There were issues and there were problems, but there was a level of cohesion that was, I think, we probably took for granted. And a number of years ago, Sarah Storer, that amazing country singer, brought out a song talking about the old timers at Camooweal. And I said to my grandmother, Gran, who is that person that, this song is talking about? And my gran said, they haven't been there that long. They're not old timers. They're just new chums. They've only been there for about 30 years or so. So it was that kind of community, just you had to be there for 100 years to be a local. But, I grew up on these stories about how the market gardeners, the Chinese market gardeners, saved almost Camooweal during the war because they managed to grow vegetables. And apparently my grandma and her sisters and quite a few other people in Camooweal at that time would dance in the watermelon patch and have all of these amazing things. So, Camooweal was pretty good.
You saw some amazing things in Camooweal. Tell me about the time the rain was unusual.
Yeah, I don't know if it does anymore. I've not lived in Camooweal for quite some time, but it was actually quite common for fish to be falling down in the rain, and kids would be running around in the rain catching up these little perch. And I didn't realise that it wasn't the thing that happened with when it rained. And when I'd left Camooweal and lived in other places, the rain was really quite boring because it was just water. But Camooweal and fish in the rain was quite a common event, as common as rain was in Camooweal, because it didn't happen very often. But
it sounds like something out of a fairy story.
Yes,
Debra, do you know how that happened? That there was little fish in the rain?
Well, there are a number of theories. Some say that the fingerlings or even eggs are sucked up into the cloud system through water spouts up in the Gulf. Because where Camooweal is on the Georgina River, and the Georgina the water it comes down from the Gulf, Burketown Way. So who knows? It just happens, Sarah. And it's amazing every time.
So as your grandma pointed out to you, this is a place where you still count as a new chum if you've been there for 30 years.
Yes.
What did your dad tell you about how you fitted in, little Debra, to this community?
It was, I think, one of the more challenging times was my dad and I were walking along the street down at Camooweal. I was probably about 6 or 7, and I noticed other Aboriginal people were walking along towards us on the same side of the street. And then when we were probably perhaps 30 metres away from each other, they crossed to the other side of the street, walked down and then crossed back over. And I'd noticed that quite a few times with different people who I knew to be Aboriginal people. And I said to Dad, I said, why are they doing that? You know, why have you had an argument with somebody? And he said, no. He says, that's just what some people do. I didn't understand what was going on. I just let that go. And then a while later, quite a while later, I found out about these certificates of exemption. And so part of the gaining of a certificate of exemption for Aboriginal people was around agreeing to not have contact with Aboriginal people. If you gained, as an Aboriginal person, if you gained the certificate of exemption, you had to cut all contact with the Aboriginal community because that certificate could be revoked. So those people who were crossing the road had certificates of exemption, and they were being and doing what they needed to do to allow them to exist within not just Camooweal, but that certificate entitled people to travel for work. You had to be able to read and write English to apply for one of those certificates. My dad never ever learnt to read or write English. He never had a certificate of exemption. And eventually, one time then I eventually said to Dad, you know, what's going on? Why do people treat us like this? And he just said, look, it's because you're black, so just get over it and move on. I said, oh, okay. So that worked in my head. It made sense. So, yes.
Tell me about the fight you saw, Debra, between two women on the street in Camooweal.
Camooweal. It was, so this is probably in the late 60s, and the two grannies, they were amazing women, and if you were Aboriginal and if you were allowed to participate in the Aboriginal community, you had grannies all over. And these two grannies were fighting with these fighting sticks. And it was down near the tennis courts at Camooweal, and there were a few of us there, and we were sitting watching as you do. And it was really quite, when I reflect, it was really quite interesting because I felt the energy coming through the earth. You know, you could feel the thudding of these fighting sticks. I have a fighting stick now that those women had, one very similar to what they had. And it's made of gidgee wood, and gidgee is a very dense wood. It's a very heavy wood. So just the energy that it would take to maintain that fight is pretty startling, I think. It was a really interesting experience because we kind of had that separation, but we were so curious as kids. Well, what are they fighting over? And it was about somebody taking the wrong food at the wrong time. But at the same time, I think there was a subtext going on that as kids we didn't quite get.
So they're heavy fighting sticks. Were those women been hurting one another?
Yes, I think absolutely. But the thing is, with traditional fighting, there are a whole lot of laws and rules around the right way to fight. So they would have been following those rules and laws, absolutely.
So more like something you might see in karate rather than like a pub fight. It's almost choreographed.
Absolutely choreographed because, you know, they would take turns in swinging that stick and they would hit the other woman. You know, one would hit the other woman in a particular area of her arm, and there was not any attempt to hit the head or the legs or anything else. So choreographed, absolutely. And yes, not a pub fight.
And you've got one of these sticks, you say.
Yes.
What do you use it for, Debra?
Oh, help my books stand up on the shelf.
Okay. I thought you were going to say help sell your books, stand behind a customer.
Yes, no, I probably wouldn't have the energy to swing it. It's a pretty amazing piece of equipment. My husband's a martial artist, and he fights with a staff. And when we were younger, I would be his sparring buddy, and whenever he sort of got a little bit overzealous with that staff, I would threaten to just go and get my stick out to show him what a real fighting stick was.
You describe this inclusive community in many ways. What was school like in Camooweal? What kind of education did you get as a young kid?
I think it was a really good education. My mum would pull us out every now and then after she realised that the curriculum had been adapted for Aboriginal students. So my mum went to Camooweal School and she sat for scholarship. She received 100% for mathematics, 100% for English, and in her words, failed abysmally at geography because she received only 85%.
That's failure.
And that was failure. So I had that example on one side, and this woman would do everything that she could to get access to books. And then my dad, who didn't read books, who didn't write, but was an amazing mechanic, an amazing horseman, amazing dad. And so every now and then Mum would pull us out of school. Often it would be when we'd go and live on the station with Dad. And so we'd go back into Camooweal and Mum would be a little bit anxious because she'd say, "Oh, I wonder what standard you're at. I just hope that you've not dropped." But when I wasn't at Camooweal, I was enrolled at the Brisbane Correspondence School, the pre-distance ed school. And I was always ahead because my mum was always such a passionate teacher and mother and all things. And we went back into Camooweal one time and this teacher had just arrived, Terry Maguire. And Mr. Maguire, one day he said, "Okay, we're going to do an art class this afternoon." And he handed out blindfolds. And I thought, oh, okay, we'll see how this goes. And he gave us pieces of charcoal. We all just sort of, picked up bits of charcoal. And he says, "Now put your blindfolds on and close your eyes and listen to this music and draw." And he played Tchaikovsky. That was phenomenally different to everything that had happened before at Camooweal. So Camooweal School was a pretty amazing place. My mum's teacher went on to become the Director General of Education. And yeah, he and my mum they were very, very happy to have each other's company in class because they were both nerds from what I can gather.
So your mum with this big academic brain and love of books, where would she get her books from?
The library. Camooweal always had a library. And then Mum would volunteer to cover the books for Camooweal School Library. So we would devour the books. And in fact, our food pantry, was at one stage they had built some new houses at Camooweal and my parents were allocated one of them. And our food pantry was actually used to store the books. And so we'd go to the pantry and take out a book.
That's wonderful.
So, yes. But, yeah, I think she'd had, because Mum was 13 when she left school. and turned 15 a month before I was born. So as a young mum, as an Aboriginal woman, as a woman in a very remote town, she did some amazing things. She always worked, but Mum always worked around the schedule of her children. And at one stage, Mum took on night work as the telephonist, which probably explains some of my accent, because my mum, she was very young. She had 3 young children. And sometimes in the quietest time of the night, when she was pretty sure that nobody was going to want to make a phone call, she would have a sleep and I would man the post office, So we practiced a lot with me making my voice sound like my mum's voice. And my mum was taught her skills as a telephonist by Mrs. Rowlands, who was the Scottish woman whose husband was an employee of the Postmaster General's office. So thanks, Mrs. Rowland.
Did you sometimes have a Scottish inflection? Little Debra on the phone here.
Yes, possibly. Mrs. Rowlands would invite us to her house, and she taught Mum and I both to knit, and she tried so valiantly to teach me how to play the piano and the organ. And as my dad also discovered, I have not a musical bone in my body. So
despite her best efforts.
Despite it all, there's nothing.
What was your experience of being in the school play at primary school, Debra?
Oh, goodness. So my parents never had a son until Danny came along. Danny, who is my mum's cousin's son, who became my little brother for a while. But most of the time my parents didn't have a male child. So my dad taught me to, I can make my own horseshoes and I can shoe my own horse. And my dad taught me all of the things that, you really need to know. So I can fix a Bedford truck and all sorts of things. So while we were in Camooweal, and it may well have been Mr. Maguire, because he did try hard to introduce the arts and all of those sorts of things, I think. The high school kids wrote a play and they were studying Shakespeare and they needed someone to play the princess. And kids out of Camooweal at that time were pretty tough kids. We were all station kids. We were all running madly around it in the bush other times. This was before all of the interesting devices and whatnot one has access to now. So nobody wanted to be the princess. And I was kind of a bit tallish for my age. And so I got conned, maybe bullied into being the princess. My mum was so excited because she thought that it was kind of the civilising of Debra, and adjusted this amazingly beautiful dress. One of my mum's sisters was always a fashionista. So I had this beautiful princess dress on, and it's only a couple of words, Debra. That's all. It's no big deal. But I couldn't pronounce "oh dearie me." I just had no hope of pronouncing, the sound that I needed to say "oh dearie me." Obviously, it's improved a bit, but what I ended up saying was really quite rude and not something that my mum was prepared to hear.
Can you repeat what you said, Debra?
I said, "oh dearie me, oh dearie me."
For a white fella, that doesn't sound too bad. That
doesn't sound too bad, but for those people who are from the Barkly Tablelands, they're all in shock right now because it's a 4-letter word and it starts with F and it ends with K. It was a very funny moment because I thought, serve you right, Mum, for making me be the princess, because nobody at Camooweal wanted it to be a princess ever.
Your dad, in contrast to your mum, wasn't a book reader in that same way, but had his own intelligence and his own love of storytelling and his own love of music. Tell me about his feelings for the great Slim Dusty.
Oh, gosh. You know, when Slim Dusty passed away, I got a phone call from my dad, and my dad was absolutely in tears, and he could barely get the words out. And he said, "Have you heard the news, Bob?" And I said, "What news, Dad?" "It's Slim." I said, "Oh, what's happened?" "Slim has died." And that was it. There were no more words. It was just this sobbing, you know. So my dad, when he met my mum, I don't know that he had a lot of examples and a lot of places to learn to speak English. So music has always been really, really important to most Aboriginal people in Australia. And certainly if you're at a remote place, country music seems often to be the thing. And Dad developed all sorts of great language skills, singing Slim Dusty, and I'd sit there and I'd listen to Mum and Dad talking about the words of these songs, and Mum would say, "No, you say it like this, it sounds like that, so this is that word." So thank goodness for Slim Dusty.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Konoski.
Deb, your dad learned English partly from the songs of Slim Dusty. What language did he grow up speaking?
He grew up with Wakaja. So my dad is Gudanji by birth, and because of, you know, events that happened in his mother and his grandparents' life, he was born on Wakaja country. So he went through Wakaja ceremonies as a young man and has always been considered to be part of the Wakaja community because of those ceremonies. So he spoke Wakaja language.
What stories would he tell you, or did he tell you, about his early life, about what had happened to him and caused him to end up in Camooweal?
One of the things he shared with me was, you know, the rape of my grandmother. And it was something that caused him huge pain, very significant trauma for him, because he says that he was about 6 or 7, and they held him by the shoulders and they said, "Watch what we're doing to your mother, because this is what you and your people are worth." So as you'd imagine, it caused huge trauma for my dad. And it's something that he always struggled with. And it really, really bothers me, because I really don't think that it's a story that only exists in my family. It's something I think that is way more common than what we want to admit, because we like to imagine that we're better than that. And it frustrates the life out of me, because people kind of constantly say, "Well, you know, that happened in the past, you need to get over it and move on." But when there's that depth of trauma, and when it is not acknowledged by the community that you live in, and when it is absolutely denied by the community that you live in, how does one move on from that? It was huge, and it continued to be until Dad passed away.
So your father had a whole lot of trauma in his childhood, as shared with other people of his community, and he ended up in Queensland working often on stations with his horsemanship and his knowledge. What was it like spending time with him when he was working on the stations, when you and your mum and your sisters would go and spend time with him?
He was a really solid character. He had a lot of integrity. He was amazingly humble. I was talking to one of my daughters yesterday, and I said, Pop just didn't like anybody who was a skite. And Raya said, I haven't heard that word since I spoke with Pop, because it was always, I don't like people who skite. And I think that some of my reticence around talking about the book is because I keep on having my dad's voice in my head, now you're skiting. I think, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, Dad. But he was as mad as, he had this amazing sense of humour. And we were breaking in a horse one time and the girth broke, and he sort of slid off the back of the horse with the saddle and landed on his feet with the saddle, still sitting in the saddle. And he says, oh, gee, better check the girth a bit better next time. And Mum and I are having pink kittens because we're thinking, good Lord, he could have killed himself. And he's laughing, and thinking, oh, I should have checked the girth. But my dad, when the Queen came to Australia in the 70s, she came to Mount Isa to see a feature horse at the Mount Isa Rodeo, and this horse was called the Barclay Brute. And the Barclay Brute was apparently a brute of a horse, and it hadn't been able to be ridden by the cowboys. And so my parents were working on Barclay Station at that stage, which was home of the Barclay Brute. And they came out, the rodeo committee came out to the station to pick up the horse, to take it into Mount Isa because the Queen was coming and she wanted to see this horse. And my dad was the horse breaker on Barclay, and they couldn't find the Barclay Brute. And they said, Lyric, where is this horse? And what horse are you looking for? And they described it. And Dad said, oh, he's my camp horse. I broke him in. I didn't realise that he was, the feature horse. So Dad had broken in this feature horse, and the Queen, of course, then couldn't see how brutish this horse was. But he loved horses. He couldn't stand people being cruel to horses. Had a real affinity. Horses and Bedford trucks.
So how would you spend your time out on the station then? Were you having to do schoolwork, or were you able to hang out with him and the horses and the Bedford trucks?
Yeah, well, out on Oban Station particularly, Dad was the bore man at that stage, and he took care of all the windmills. I was on correspondence lessons, and all of the lessons for the week would come in one book. And so you worked your way through one book across a week, then, the next book. So I would do the week's worth of lessons on Monday, and the rest of the time I had then with my dad. So I grew up watching him and helping him build windmills and repair windmills, and we built a couple of Bedford trucks together. And, when I was 7, I was helping him break in horses and helping him break in my own horse. It was an amazing, amazing childhood.
How did the other Jackaroos relate to you and your mum and siblings when you were out on those stations around Camooweal?
We were quite separate from other people on the station often, because if people understand what a cattle station kind of generally looks like, there's the collection of buildings that constitute the station, and there's a fence run around that, to keep the cattle out. Our caravan was on the outside of that fence, and we were not allowed inside the fence. So we had limited contact, and my dad liked to keep the separation because he kind of felt a little bit safer, and he just wasn't quite sure, I think, about who he could trust. Sometimes we'd go into Camooweal, and I remember times at the hall at Camooweal when Aboriginal people weren't allowed inside, and I thought that was kind of in the past significantly, but Camooweal had its centenary, and there was a policeman at the gate, and I was going to go into the hall to have a look at photographs. And he said, no, you can't come in. I said, why? And he said, you just can't. And as I was standing there, Mrs. Miller came along. Mrs. Miller, her family were one of the storekeepers in town, an amazing woman. And she said, Debra, how are you? You coming in to see the photographs? And I said, no, Mrs. Miller, I'm not allowed in. I said, I'm not quite sure why. And she looked at the police officer and she said, why is Debra not allowed in? And he says, oh, well, she's just not allowed in. And she said, you listen here. There are photographs over half of the wall in there of Debra's family. She will be allowed in. Now move aside. But for Mrs. Miller coming along saying that kind of exclusion and separation is, and it still happens in some parts of remote Australia. So it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing, particularly when you are on what you consider to be home ground. It's really hard.
Your dad got this job out at Oban. What was unusual about the drive out to that station? What happened?
So Oban is west of Mount Isa. So to get to Oban, we were going through Barkly. It's a really beautiful country. It's quite often dry, and we were pulling the caravan along on our way across to Oban. He was really excited about going to Oban because he'd met the manager and he was quite taken with Henry Corbett, who was the manager at Oban. And we were driving along and I was watching out the window and there was this plume of smoke that was really, really strange and kind of like the fish falling from the sky. It was there was something a bit odd, but I thought, it's a fire. As we were going along, it was moving in this really strange way, and it was quite a large plume of smoke. And Dad suddenly pulled over and started running around like a madman, was putting Mum and my sisters into the caravan and wondering what's going on, why are we stopping? Because if that's a fire, we're on this really beautiful plain country with all this grass and we probably should be driving madly to get out of here. But it was a plague of grasshoppers, and the grasshoppers kind of covered everything. It wasn't funny at the time. It was quite scary. It was a cloud of smoke, made up of grasshoppers, totally enveloped the car and the caravan. It turned black, and there were these thuds on the outside of the caravan, with grasshoppers. And Dad, again, making funny, talking about the headless ringer out at Alexandria and playing these mad games just to keep my sisters from being scared of the grasshoppers. And my mum was always a bit more serious than my dad and was always trying to keep him under control. Behave yourself, lyric. But yeah, she didn't often succeed.
And what was the aftermath like when you opened the door of the caravan?
It was just awful. It's just globby custard everywhere. We had grasshopper bits and all over and because we were travelling, I didn't have shoes on. We sort of crunch when we go back to get in the car. And yeah, it's the smell, and I swear I can still remember that smell. There's always mad things happening out bush.
What were the couple who ran that station at Oban, who your dad had met, what were they like to live with?
They were pretty amazing people. We were really quite fascinated with Mr. and Mrs. Corbett. So her name was Beverly, and she was such a lady, but she was so down to earth. And they just saw that we were a family and that we were people. They were really excited for us to be at Oban because they had 3 sons, each 1 year older than the 3 of us. So
sounds like the Brady Bunch.
It was the Brady Bunch, these 3 little white boys and 3 little brown girls. We got on really well together. And Mrs. Corbett would take us mushrooming. She would take us into the kitchen of the main house, and the cook would get so upset because, she really didn't want these little brown kids in her kitchen. And Mrs. Corbett would just play music on the radio, the wireless, and would sing and dance us all around the kitchen. Yeah, they were really, really lovely people. Mr. Corbett had a sense of humour very similar to my dad, so they were always laughing and carrying on. But, one time Oban put in a new crow's nest dam, and we thought, we should go out swimming. And I don't know why we thought that, because Oban is in dry country and I certainly couldn't swim. My sisters couldn't swim. I don't know if the Corbett kids could swim, but the Christmas before, our families had bought us all bikes. So off we went on our bikes, and we were sinking into the mud. It was really quite a dangerous thing to do, and not the best choice. And we heard a car coming, and it was Mr. Corbett in the Toyota, and he was livid. He was just really scared, and I think grateful that there were 4 heads still bobbing above the water. And it was the only time I'd ever seen him angry. And he said, "You kids get on those bikes and get your backsides back to the station, and if I catch any of you, you'll know what for." Well, it was the first time that Warren, his eldest son is Warren, it was the first time that Warren and I just totally disregarded our younger brother and sister, because we just, Sharon and Dixon was somewhere behind us.
To their own fates.
Care. We did not care. We might have figured that, if Mr. Corbett got them first, it'd give us a bit more time to get out of there. So, yes.
What did your mum get to do there? Your dad was working on the bores. What about your mum?
When partners worked on stations in those days, the husband would go out and be a stockman of some sort, or take care of the bores in Dad's case there, and his wife would often be the housemaid. And so that's what the arrangement was for Mum. But when Mrs. Corbett realised that Mum adored learning and books and all of that, Mrs. Corbett said, "Well, why don't we swap?" And again, the cook was horrified, but Mrs. Corbett said, "It's okay, don't worry about the cook." And my mum would supervise lessons for a while. My average mark all the time my mum supervised me was 97%.
Did you stay in touch with that family after you left Oban?
Mum and Dad kept contact with them. It was a constant kind of friendship. It was one of those really old-fashioned kind of friendships with a real integrity around the respect. So they were amazing people.
You've been married to your husband Rick for 40 years or so?
37 years, yes.
Where did you first meet one another?
Mount Isa, of course.
Where all the great love stories start.
They all start, and not just Mount Isa, but the Irish Club in Mount Isa. So, it was one of those eyes meeting across the smoke-filled disco floor. People still smoked inside in those days, and that was it. A week after, he asked me to marry him.
A week?
A week. And I said to Rick, you're not allowed to tell my dad, because if my dad knows that, we've seen each other 3 times and I've agreed to marry you, it's not going to be good for either of us, but mostly you.
How different were the two of you?
He's a white guy. He's a surfer. He was a surfer. I'm Aboriginal. I'm from remote. I'm from the bush. I grew up on horses and in remote places, dirt and dust and all of that, spinifex, gidgee. Rick grew up on a surfboard on the Gold Coast, so very different, very, very different. But yeah, it's worked.
You'd warned him about how your dad might react. How did the first meeting between your future husband and your mum and dad go?
Well, my mum, she just knew that the flowers that he came with were for her. So that was it. My mum thought he was wonderful. My dad's not a crazy man. He wasn't fooled at all. Rick was the first non-Aboriginal person that we invited into our home who wasn't, somebody that Dad was familiar with work or anything like that. So it was a big deal, and my mum made a roast. Everybody kind of ate roasts in those days for important events. And the conversation, the non-verbal conversation that was going on between my parents and I was not a good one. And at the end of the night when he left, my dad said, "Bub, he's a white fella, right?" And I thought, I just didn't know how to respond. I thought, "Oh, really, Dad? How'd you know?" But yeah, they worked it out. Their relationship had a few ups and downs, but they got on really well.
What did your daughter say to you, Debra, that made you think it was time to take your kids out to Gudanji country and let them have time back home?
Yeah, I've taught at Borroloola School quite a few times, so we always made these huge trips to the Territory and back again because Rick's family are on the Gold Coast and my parents were in Mount Isa and Dad's family were all up at Borroloola. And we'd done that quite a few times, and then we were down here on the Sunshine Coast and our eldest daughter said, "Oh, I don't like those shoes. I love op shopping and I'm the best op shopper. I have the most amazing collection of antique linen that was mostly sourced from various op shops. So I'd bought these shoes, but my daughter said, "I don't like those shoes. I want, these labelled shoes that everybody else was wearing at school."
You'd got the wrong brand from the op shop, had your mum?
I got the wrong brand from the op shop, which was, not good shopping, Mum. And I was quite affronted that my child would say, "No, I don't want those. I want these," because, you have to just be grateful for having shoes. And I wondered where I'd gone wrong. And Rick and I sat down because neither of us were impressed, and we thought, right, we'll fix her little red wagon. And we bought a caravan and didn't pay a whole lot of money for it and packed up the kids. I gave them each a plastic tub and said, "Put into that tub what you cannot live without. Don't worry about putting in anything that needs electricity, and don't worry about putting in anything that needs batteries, because where we're going, there's no electricity and there are no shops for batteries. So, stick with books and boots." So we arrive on our place and we park under a tree and gave the kids fishing lines, and I also gave them a jar each with some alfalfa seeds and taught them how to sprout their alfalfa because you're not going to a shop anytime soon. They learnt about being careful about the rivers because the crocodiles were there, and they learnt all sorts of things. They walked around country with their aunties and their grandparents, and they learnt all of those stories, and the three of them will say what an amazing time that was, that it was the best time of their lives. And, my daughters, who are the mothers of my two granddaughters, they want to take their girls home and have that experience as well. No, it was good. My kids are amazing bush people. They can live off country really, really well.
You and Rick spent time out there on country again when you were working on your PhD.
Yeah. My cousin's family lived in a house a couple of 100 metres away from where we set up our camp. We took a generator so that I could run the laptop. We would catch mudgega overnight and have them for breakfast. That's the freshwater crayfish. I would write, I would do some drawing, and we would go walking in the cool of the afternoon. and we would catch fish for dinner and do it all over again the next day.
You're smiling when you talk about that.
Oh, it's just a whole other world. It's just, you can breathe out there, you know. It's a whole other time and it's a whole other space, and there's a gentleness that's not often present in the place that I'm living now. I mean, I live at Budrum, and it's a beautiful community. It's a wonderful community. It's a very accepting community, but it's not home in the way that Little River is home, that Gudanji is home. Yeah.
What did your son make for you, though, so you had a taste of city comfort while you're out there breathing in, breathing out and eating that good fresh fish?
See, people think that the Northern Territory is always warm, and that's just so not right, because it gets quite cold. And I can live without most things except books and a hot shower. So my son, who is really, really amazing with technology, and he takes after my dad, you know, all things mechanical, Carl can deal with it. So he just made me a lovely little device that I could have hot showers with. So, you know, we're out in the centre of the universe, 10 hours from Darwin, hour and a half from Borroloola, on country with this beautiful hot water. Yay.
Perfect. You'd sing Slim Dusty as you were soaping under the
Slim
stars.
Dusty, and that's it. And Sarah, the stars are a whole other thing out there on the tablelands particularly. You know, you roll out your swag and the stars are this huge dome over the top of you that is beyond magnificent. It's an absolute privilege to sleep under that thing.
Well, Debra, the next best thing to being able to be there is hearing you talk about it. Thank you so much for sharing some of your stories on Conversations.
Thank you, Sarah. I really enjoyed chatting today.
This is Conversations with Sarah Konoski.
That was my conversation with Debra Dank from last year. And Debra's memoir, We Come From This Place, was recently awarded the Book of the Year at the New South Wales Literary Awards. A big congratulations, Debra, from us at Conversations. And that was the final in our NAIDOC Week Conversations. Thank you to Charlie King and producers Lisa Pellegrino and Sejan Stowe for bringing us stories from Larrakia country. You can listen to all of those, as well as my conversation with Debra, on our website and, of course, as a podcast. And you can find plenty more NAIDOC stories at the ABC Indigenous website. I'm Sarah Konoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Konoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.